When you board a plane, you're not thinking about profit. You're not thinking about quarterly earnings or how much a decision cost the company. You're trusting that the aircraft was designed to get you there alive. For decades, one name stood for absolute safety. But then that company began making very different decisions. And the cost of those decisions wasn't measured in money, but in human lives. This is not a story about a single airplane or a single mistake. This is a story about how Boeing slowly stopped being an engineering company and became just another business. About how decisions that looked reasonable on paper became deadly in the air. And why the consequences of those decisions turned out to be irreversible. For decades, Boeing was more than an aircraft maker. It was a symbol of engineering excellence. Inside the company, engineers had the final say. Safety came before deadlines. Principles came before profit. If an aircraft wasn't ready, it didn't fly. No matter how much pressure came from the market, pilots trusted Boeing instinctively. Airlines were willing to pay a premium for one reason: the name stood for reliability in the air. That trust wasn't built overnight. It was earned over decades, one aircraft at a time. Boeing became synonymous with safe flight, and that reputation allowed the company to move slowly, to be cautious, and to resist panic. Which is exactly why the fall, when it came, was so devastating. By the early 2000s, Boeing faced a threat it hadn't seen in decades. Airbus was preparing a new aircraft. The A320neo promised significantly lower fuel costs, and airlines were ready to switch. For Boeing, this wasn't just competition, it was an existential risk. Developing a brand new airplane would take years, it would cost billions, and it would mean falling behind. Airlines didn't want to wait, they wanted efficiency now. Inside Boeing, the pressure mounted. Sales teams warned of lost contracts. Executives warned of lost market share. The company had a choice. Take the slow, expensive path of building something new, or take a faster route that looked reasonable on paper. Management chose speed. They decided to update an existing aircraft, sell it as familiar, and avoid costly retraining for pilots. It was framed as a smart business move, a practical solution, a way to stay competitive without starting from scratch. But that decision came with compromises, and those compromises would quietly reshape everything that followed. By this point, Boeing no longer had the luxury of time. Airlines were watching Airbus, sales teams were already losing ground, and inside the company, leadership knew that building a brand new aircraft from scratch would mean years of delays and billions in costs. So Boeing made a defining choice. Instead of designing a new plane, the company decided to fundamentally rework an old one. The 737 platform had been flying for decades. It was familiar to pilots, it was trusted by airlines, and most importantly, it allowed Boeing to promise something critical to its customers: minimal retraining. That promise mattered. If Boeing could convince regulators and airlines that this aircraft was essentially the same as previous 737 models, pilots wouldn't need expensive simulator training, airlines wouldn't face delays, and Boeing could move faster than its competitor. On paper, it was an elegant solution, but the problem was structural. New, larger engines had to be mounted differently. That change altered the aircraft's aerodynamics in subtle but dangerous ways. The plane now behaved differently under certain flight conditions. Inside Boeing, engineers understood this. They knew the aircraft no longer flew like earlier versions of the 737. They knew additional safeguards would be required, and they knew those safeguards would introduce new risks of their own. At this moment, Boeing faced a second choice. They could slow down, redesign the aircraft properly, accept delays and higher costs, or they could manage the difference quietly. Leadership chose the second option. Rather than redesign the airframe, Boeing decided to correct the aircraft's behavior through software. The goal was not to make the plane safer than before. The goal was to make it feel familiar. That distinction mattered. The company's internal priority was clear: avoid triggering new training requirements, avoid regulatory complications, and keep the aircraft marketable as a simple upgrade. This was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a strategic decision, a decision to treat a fundamental engineering problem as a software issue, a decision to preserve speed and sales over transparency and margin for error. From that moment forward, Boeing was no longer just responding to pressure. It had committed itself to a path where turning back would mean admitting that the premise of the aircraft was flawed. And once that commitment was made, every decision that followed became harder to reverse. At the center of Boeing's solution was a piece of software most pilots had never heard of. It was called MCAS. Officially, it existed to make the aircraft handle like earlier versions of the 737. In reality, it was designed to correct a problem the airframe itself could no longer hide. Because of the new engines, the aircraft behaved differently at certain angles. Instead of redesigning the plane, Boeing chose to correct that behavior through automation. MCAS had a simple job: push the nose of the aircraft down if it sensed a potential stall. But the way it was implemented revealed how far priorities had shifted. The system relied on data from a single sensor. It could activate repeatedly, and it operated largely without pilot awareness. Pilots were not fully briefed on its existence. Training materials barely mentioned it, and in some cases, it wasn't mentioned at all. From Boeing's perspective, this was intentional. The more transparent the system became, the harder it would be to argue that the aircraft was essentially the same as older models. MCAS was not designed to be a prominent safety feature. It was designed to stay invisible. That invisibility was the point. A complex engineering problem had been turned into a quiet software correction, and by doing so, Boeing transformed a design compromise into a single point of failure. MCAS wasn't the cause of what happened next. It was the proof. Proof that speed, familiarity, and marketability had taken precedence over clarity, redundancy, and margin for error. On October 29, 2018, a Boeing 737 MAX operated by Lion Air crashed into the Java Sea just minutes after takeoff. All 189 people on board were killed. Flight data later showed the aircraft repeatedly forcing its nose downward. The pilots struggled to understand what was happening. They were fighting a system they didn't know existed. At the time, the crash was treated as an isolated incident. Boeing reassured airlines and regulators that the aircraft was safe. Operations continued. The fleet stayed in the air. The warning had arrived, but it hadn't been accepted yet. On March 10, 2019, another Boeing 737 MAX crashed. This time, it was operated by Ethiopian Airlines. The aircraft went down just minutes after takeoff. All 157 people on board were killed. The details were different. The outcome was the same. Flight data showed the aircraft repeatedly forcing its nose downward. Pilots faced the same loss of control, the same confusion, the same fight against an automated system. This time, the explanation of coincidence no longer held. 2 crashes, 2 airlines, 2 continents. The pattern was undeniable. Within days, aviation authorities around the world grounded the 737 MAX fleet. What had once been framed as an isolated incident was now understood as a systemic failure. After the second crash, the focus shifted from speculation to investigation. Regulators, journalists, and congressional committees began examining how the aircraft had been certified and approved. What they found was deeply troubling. Internal emails revealed engineers raising concerns about MCAS long before the crashes. Some warned that the system was too powerful. Others questioned its reliance on a single sensor. Those concerns did not stop the program. Investigators also discovered that key details about MCAS had not been fully disclosed to regulators. In some cases, Boeing employees themselves acted as intermediaries in the certification process, effectively reviewing their own work. Training requirements were minimized, simulator sessions were avoided, critical information was withheld to preserve the aircraft's classification as a minor variation of an existing model. One internal message captured the shift perfectly. A Boeing employee described the aircraft as being designed by clowns, supervised by managers. This was no longer about a single system or a single failure. The investigations made one thing clear: the crashes were not the result of unpredictable pilot error or random malfunction. They were the outcome of known risks, documented concerns, and decisions that had been approved at the highest levels. The cost of Boeing's decisions became impossible to ignore. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide for nearly 2 years. Production slowed, then stopped. Deliveries were frozen. Boeing paid billions in compensation to airlines for grounded aircraft and lost revenue. Legal settlements with victims' families added further costs. Regulatory fines followed. By the time the aircraft returned to service, the total financial impact had reached tens of billions of dollars. But the damage went beyond money. Airlines began questioning Boeing's promises. Pilots demanded additional training. Regulators tightened oversight, ending the era of quiet approvals. Inside the company, leadership was reshuffled. Executives resigned. The culture Boeing once prided itself on was publicly called into question. Most importantly, the brand changed. For decades, Boeing had been associated with trust and reliability. After the crashes, its name became linked to controversy, investigations, and doubt. The company survived, but the confidence it once commanded did not return overnight. The price had been paid in full, in cash, in credibility, and in lost trust. Boeing's collapse did not begin with a crash. It began with a decision to treat an engineering problem as a business inconvenience, a decision to prioritize speed over transparency, a decision to assume that trust, once earned, could be spent. Nothing that followed was inevitable. At multiple points, the company could have slowed down, spoken openly, or chosen a safer path. It didn't. Instead, small compromises accumulated until the margin for error disappeared. And when that margin vanished, the consequences were no longer abstract. This story is not about software. It is not about pilots, and it is not about a single aircraft. It is about what happens when a company trusted with human lives starts behaving like any other business. In aviation, mistakes are unforgiving, and once trust is broken, no amount of engineering can rebuild it overnight. That is the real cost of Boeing's decisions.